Most people believe that being remembered is a matter of effort. More messages, more attention, more trying. They assume that if they just keep showing up, keep talking, keep saying the right things often enough, eventually they'll stay on someone's mind. But that's not how it works. In fact, the truth is almost the opposite. The people we remember the most are rarely the ones who tried the hardest. They're not the ones who filled every silence or sent the most words. They're the ones who said something small, something simple, something unexpected, a sentence, a moment that lingered. Pause for a second and think about your own life. Have you ever had someone say just a few words to you? Nothing dramatic, nothing extraordinary, and yet somehow it stayed with you. You found yourself replaying it later, not because you were trying to, but because your mind kept returning to it, quietly, almost automatically. That's not coincidence. That's how the human mind works. We don't remember effort, we remember impact. And when it comes to emotional connection, impact doesn't come from saying more. It comes from creating a feeling. Because at the end of the day, no one sits there remembering every message you sent. They remember how you made them feel in a moment. That feeling is what lingers. That feeling is what echoes later, when everything else is silent. That feeling is what brings your presence back into their thoughts, even when you're not there. And once you understand this, something begins to shift. You stop trying so hard to impress. You stop overthinking every word. You stop chasing attention. And instead, you begin to create moments. Moments that stay. This isn't about tricks. It isn't about memorizing lines. And it certainly isn't about pretending to be someone you're not. This is about understanding something deeper. The psychology behind why some words disappear instantly, while others leave a lasting imprint. Because once you understand that, the way you communicate changes completely. Now, here's something most people don't realize. If you observe how people usually approach connection, you'll notice a pattern. They believe that more effort leads to more interest, so they do more, they message more, they explain more, they try harder to be funny, more engaging, more impressive. And on the surface, it seems logical. If you want someone to think about you, shouldn't you give them more of you? But in reality, something very different happens. The more you try to force attention, the less impact you actually create. Because attention isn't built on effort. It's built on feeling. Imagine this. If someone hears from you constantly, multiple times a day, at first it might feel engaging, then it becomes familiar, then predictable, and eventually it becomes invisible, not because there's anything wrong with you, but because the human brain is designed to filter out what feels routine. It doesn't hold on to what's constant, it holds on to what feels different. So when your presence becomes expected, your words slowly fade into the background. And this is where most people get it wrong. They confuse attention with emotional impact. Just because someone responds doesn't mean they're thinking about you later. Just because a conversation continues doesn't mean it meant anything. You can talk all day and still leave no trace, because without emotional weight, words don't stay. They pass through. And this is why trying harder often backfires. Long explanations, constant checking in, over-communication. It doesn't create intrigue. It removes it. It answers everything too quickly. It leaves nothing unfinished, nothing to explore, nothing to wonder about. And without curiosity, there is nothing for the mind to return to later, because the mind is drawn to what feels incomplete, to what lingers just slightly out of reach. So the real problem isn't a lack of effort. It's a misunderstanding of how memory actually works. Because memory isn't built on repetition. It's built on emotion. The brain doesn't function like a recorder, storing every word exactly as it was said. It filters. It keeps what feels meaningful and discards what feels ordinary. And what determines meaning? Emotion. Anything that creates a feeling, Even a subtle one gets marked as important. Curiosity, surprise, intrigue, even a slight sense of confusion. These are the moments the brain holds on to. Think about your own experiences. You probably don't remember most conversations you had recently, but there are certain moments, certain phrases, certain interactions that stayed with you. Not because they were long, but because they made you feel something. That's emotional imprinting. When a moment carries emotional weight, the brain tags it as significant. And because of that, it becomes easier to recall. It comes back without effort. Now apply that to connection. If what you say creates no emotional shift, it simply passes through awareness. But if something you say triggers even a small reaction, a spark of curiosity, a moment of pause, a subtle feeling of that was different, then it stays. And here's the deeper part. The brain doesn't just remember emotional moments, it revisits them. That's why certain interactions replay in your mind when you're alone, when things are quiet, when your thoughts wander. That replay is what builds connection over time. Not constant conversation, not endless communication, but a single moment that continues to exist long after it's over. And this leads to something important. One of the biggest reasons people become forgettable is because they rely on what feels safe. Safe words, safe questions, safe conversations. How are you? How was your day? Hope you're doing well. There's nothing wrong with these. They're polite, they're respectful, but they don't create any emotional reaction. And without emotion, there is no memory. Think about how often someone hears those exact same phrases, not just from one person, but from many. They all sound the same, they all feel the same, so the brain treats them the same. It ignores them. Not because they're bad, but because they're predictable. And predictability fades. This is the quiet truth. You can be kind, consistent, always present, and still be completely forgettable. Because being pleasant is not the same as being memorable. Pleasant fades. Impact stays. And impact requires something more. Something that interrupts the ordinary. Something that makes the mind pause, even for a second, and think. That felt different. So what actually creates that feeling? It comes down to subtle emotional triggers, not big dramatic emotions, but small shifts, a hint of curiosity, a touch of mystery, a moment that feels slightly unfinished, because the mind doesn't replay what it fully understands. It replays what it's still trying to figure out. When something is clear and predictable, the brain moves on. But when something feels open-ended, the mind holds on to it. It asks questions. What did that mean? Why did that feel different? Why am I thinking about this again? And that is where connection begins, not in loud excitement, but in quiet curiosity. Another powerful element is imagery, words that create a picture. Stay longer than words that don't. When someone can see what you're saying, feel it internally, it becomes an experience, not just information. And the brain always prioritizes experience. Then there's unexpectedness. The moment something breaks the pattern, the mind pays attention, because anything different is automatically seen as important. This is called pattern interruption. When something doesn't follow the usual flow, the brain flags it and remembers it. But here's where it becomes even more powerful. It's not just about what you say, it's about how much you say. Because doing less often creates more impact than doing more. This is where most people struggle. They feel the need to keep things going, to fill every silence, to maintain constant presence. But constant presence removes anticipation. And without anticipation, there is nothing to feel. If someone always knows you'll reply instantly, always knows you're available, always knows the conversation will continue, there's nothing left to wonder about, nothing left to miss. And when there's nothing to miss, there's nothing to think about later. This is why space is powerful. not as a strategy, not as a game, but as a natural part of how emotion develops. When there's a pause after a meaningful moment, the mind continues, it replays, it reflects, it holds on to the feeling. That's where connection grows, in the silence, after the moment. But most people interrupt that process. They send another message, they explain what they meant, they try to keep everything alive, and in doing that, they erase the very thing that would have made them memorable, because the mind needs space. Space to process, space to feel. Without that, even meaningful words lose their impact. Now, when you combine all of this, something interesting happens. Emotion, space, difference, together, they create something powerful, and it can be expressed in something incredibly simple. 3 words. I noticed that. Simple, quiet, but deeply effective when used naturally, because these words do something most people never do. They make someone feel seen, not in a general way, but in a specific, personal way, and that changes everything. Instead of saying something common, like something expected, you say something observed, something real, something that shows attention, and suddenly the interaction feels different, because now it carries meaning. It creates a moment, and more importantly, it creates a question. When did they notice that? What else do they see? And just like that, the mind becomes engaged. It begins to replay. Not because you said more, but because what you said mattered. But even something powerful can lose its effect if used incorrectly. This is where awareness becomes important, because the power is not just in the words, it's in the timing, the tone, and the authenticity behind them. If something feels forced, it loses its impact. If it's overused, it becomes predictable. If it's explained too much, it removes the mystery. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is say something meaningful and then stop. Let it sit. Let it breathe. Let the silence do its work, because that silence is where the mind begins to move, where feelings begin to form, where memory begins to take shape. And when you step back and see the bigger picture, everything becomes clear. Connection was never about saying more. It was never about trying harder. And it was never about being perfect. It has always been about creating a moment that stays. Because people don't remember constant noise. They remember what made them feel something unexpected, a shift, a pause, a sentence that carried weight. And when you understand that, you stop chasing attention and you start becoming someone who is naturally remembered, not because you tried harder, but because you understood what actually matters. And sometimes, all it takes is one moment, one sentence, one feeling that lingers long after everything else fades.